What is the beam gun? That's a question that Dead Rising fans have been asking themselves since 2010, as that was the year the first tools were created to allow us to explore the game's files. It was also around then that the Noesis model viewer added support for Dead Rising, which would let us view 3D models from the game outside of the game. Back then, anyone who took advantage of these new tools would be able to explore the files and discover a bunch of strange unknown assets in the game. Basic data mining would allow us to find stuff that dated as far back as a year before release. Exploring far enough and deep enough into the files would eventually have you finding a specific model in the files, with absolutely no explanation behind it. Of course, that being the beam gun. It didn't really matter what questions you had upon seeing this thing. There was no answers in sight, and there wouldn't be for many years. To make things even worse, we also didn't actually know the name of this thing. The discovery of the name beam gun is a pretty recent thing. So back then, we made up our own names for it, like space rifle or gravity gun. Also, back then, our first glimpse of this model actually looked like this. Normally, under its original conditions, the beam gun model is actually broken and won't draw its texture over the entire model. Both the model viewer and in-game were plagued with this issue, so for years and years, the image of this thing in our minds was this flickering, horrible-looking mess. Repairing the model so that the texture is applied correctly and discovering its original name are two pretty recent endeavors. Seeing the beam gun today in all of its properly textured glory is pretty amazing, but it still does not answer any of our questions here. Why is this weapon that goes completely unseen in the game just sitting dormant in the files? Where the hell did it come from? In the retail version of the game, be that the original release on 360 or even the newer remaster on PC, the beam gun is silently snoozing within the game's files. But there is absolutely nothing you can do in-game to actually obtain it. Through some basic modding, you can get the beam gun to load into the game, but seeing it on the floor or carrying it around in your inventory is really all you're gonna get from it. Today, the beam gun does nothing. It can't be fired, it has no audio files or effects, it has no unique animations, nothing. It's just a treasure item that you can keep around with you, kind of like the gnome in Half-Life 2. It sounds like a bit of a drag, this mysterious item in the game that has left us questioning its existence for years turns out to be completely worthless. But luckily, that's not where it ends. You see, the beam gun was a weapon that Capcom was experimenting with since probably the beginning of Dead Rising's development. We obviously don't have access to every pre-release version of Dead Rising ever made, but we do have access to a build that is about half a year before release. And within that build, the beam gun is still in the files. But the thing is, despite it being a much older version of the game, the beam gun is still broken and still inaccessible. It's kind of fair to assume then that Capcom never actually had the beam gun working. It was likely an idea that they came up with very early in development and long before the idea of the Mega Buster. But as time went on, the beam gun was kind of just shoved under the rug. What's interesting though is that there is something a bit unique about it the earlier you go back in development. You see, in the final game, the beam gun is worthless, but in older versions of Dead Rising, miraculously, it actually works. Kinda. It's essentially just going to behave like the machine gun. You'll hold it the same way, it'll use the same firing animation, and even the same reticle on the screen. The only uniqueness about it is that it's semi-automatic instead of a machine gun. Firing it, strangely, flashes a red light out of the front, similarly to the toy Mega Buster. The actual firing effect is sadly missing, and no pre-release version of the game seems to have the effect in the files. Amazingly though, it does have a firing sound. As far as the firing effect goes, we assume it was going to be something like the PRL from Resident Evil 4, just a beam of light or something like that. Currently, our most likely theory is that the origins of this beam gun is from Lost Planet, because as we know, Lost Planet and Dead Rising were being made roughly at the same time. It's possible Capcom wanted to have various Easter eggs between the two games. This actually did end up happening, as in Dead Rising, there's a book or movie cover with Lost Planet on it. And in Lost Planet, the player can use a special player model of Frank West. This beam gun might have been yet another reference to Lost Planet. Perhaps the beam gun was a weapon that was going to be in Lost Planet at some point. The closest model I can find in Lost Planet that might be the beam gun is called the plasma gun, as it sort of looks similar, but it could just be a huge coincidence. Of course, I've also heard of the beam gun being a Mega Man reference, but I honestly couldn't really find any Mega Man references to this thing that make a perfect match. I mean, there's the beam machine gun, but it looks nothing like it. It's possible the original reward for the Genocider achievement was going to be the beam gun, but it was changed in favor of the Mega Buster, as that's obviously 100 times more iconic. I've heard theories from community members that originally Brock would pull out the beam gun during the final battle, and instead of dodging his punches, you originally had to dodge this unholy thing. There's obviously no substantial evidence to this, it's just a theory that people have. But what makes this somewhat plausible is that there's also claymore mines in the game's files that Brock was likely going to use during the final battle. So the beam gun could have been the same idea. Capcom wanted to give Brock a weapon until deciding it should just be a fist fight instead. We're pretty blessed by the amount of info that we have on this thing, to be honest. We know its name, we know what it sounded like, and we know what it's meant to look like completely textured, which is 3 things we could have never imagined back in 2010. What do you think this thing would have been? Write it down in the comments, I'm curious if I missed anything. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.